first recollection I have of the mangroves was going floundering with my father. And so I was 7 then, and that made its 49, 50 era. There were mangroves on the edge of the bank going up that road, that side river. There were some on the flat area going up to King Road, but not very many. But there was none in the harbour itself. So wherever you went in the harbour, there was no mangroves.
Like a few people, I spent some time looking at White's aviation photos, which are the earliest reliable aerial record, taken in the late 40s, 50s, and there's no real evidence of mangroves in Mangawhai Harbour at all. The area to the west of the Insley Road entrance to Mangawhai was quite open water. Sandy beaches appear to be there.
If you look back at history, there was a lot of land being developed by Land and Survey, all of King Road, and it was all for the rehab farmers, the ones that had been serving overseas in the war. And so there was all that agricultural land was getting worked over. Plus there was other land towards the other arm of the Mangawhai Harbour, up Paul Roadway. And there was a lot of runoff. The runoff from the farmland basically helped fertilise the mangroves. And they grew quite prolifically. But of course, with the runoff, there comes the siltation. And with the siltation, the mangroves can, even nowadays, they drop their pods that'll start new plants, but most of them just go out to sea. Back in those days, of course, when they first settled on the mudflats, then they got a toehold into the ground there. And with that fertiliser as well, I believe that's how they started to flourish.
When I was at primary school, the ocean or the estuary was our swimming pool. And if you drive just out of Mangawhai on the left now, you'll see a post in the ground, and we had a bar and another post, and that was our swimming pool. That was our kicking bar. And on occasions we would be joined by dolphins, which was the highlight of swimming lessons in the Mangawhai Harbour. There was hardly any mangroves in my primary school days. The causeway had just gone in, the bridge had just gone in, and I remember spending a lot of time on the western side, white sand beaches, no mangroves. So the mangroves established after the establishment of the causeway and the bridge.
It was sometime in mid-50s that Alan Markwick and his wife used to go up to above the causeway going south from the school. Now there's a little story there with that causeway. When it was first built, there was 2 bridges there, one right by the school and one where there is today. And the volume of water that came off the land there was uninterrupted. It went straight through those 2 bridges, under those 2 bridges, and out to sea. And it had a flushing effect on the seabed. When they changed and put that causeway, built it up a bit higher, they did away with that first bridge. That stopped the flow of water coming from all the way up Tara Roadway down and through there. So it had to find its own way across to the new bridge. So Alan and Peggy Markwick used to go up there, and they said their belief was if they didn't go up there and pull mangroves, they were going to take over the Mangawhai Harbour. So every Sunday they used to go up there and pull mangroves out.
But in essence, once we started intensifying dairying, extending that pastoral farming up into the hill country, intensifying it with aerial top dressing, we see the same pattern in many places. The early work showed that there was a limit to our mangroves, which is purely temperature induced down to the Bay of Plenty. But there were also limits to their extent within harbours, and now we're seeing places like Tauranga Harbour, Paringaringa in the Northland, many harbours are now suffering from an extensive spread, Omaha, the whangatau, of mangroves that wasn't there before.
Omaha reproduce exactly what we've done here, big causeway with a bridge, and on the top side the mangroves are going to establish.
I lived on the Poto Peninsula after moving from university, and I was able to see the rapid invasion of mangroves into places like Tangatiki Bay, you know, which we used to go floundering and they were clear. By the time we left, they were invaded with mangroves.
Most people are just not aware that there were no mangroves in Mangawhai way back, 1945. People just assume that they were always there. But however, the community, I think, does need to be more aware that human activity has created this situation. And again, it needs to be human activity that manages them. I think we're stuck with where it is a bit at the moment. There may be some small areas we might be able to, like Back Bay and areas like that, where the trackies have removed some to put their walkway through.
Well, this is where the debate really starts.
I'm aware it's a prickly subject. There's good people on both sides of the argument, and it's trying to find a very balanced middle environment versus, you know, harbour.
There's only a few people that are actually aware of the problem. Most people, the common view is that mangroves are an important conservation plant. They're a native species that's capitalising on the current environment, which has been created by anthropogenic means. They're an indigenous species out of control.
But I think it was work by Professor Chapman of the Auckland University Botany School in the 80s when he wrote scientific papers on mangroves and basically transferred the conclusions of work on tropical mangroves, which themselves are still contested, but included transferred those conclusions to New Zealand. And the irony was there was a paper in the same volume, I think, by Taylor, identifying just how sterile mangroves were in the Whangatau Harbour compared to the adjoining areas of open water.
People have extrapolated the benefit of tropical mangroves to the New Zealand situation, and that's just totally wrong.
The assumption that they brought the same values as tropical and subtropical mangroves, I think is the problem.
Sure, mangroves do have uses. They can control foreshore erosion. So, you know, we need to get a different perspective. They don't deserve the conservation icon that people inherit them with.
So I then have seen various regional councils' documents extolling the values of mangroves and how important they were to preserve, but they only really cite each other. They don't seem to go back to the scientific literature or the empirical research that shows a significant loss of biodiversity under mangroves.
The policies at the moment all protect them. Again, it represents an ideology which has come forward about their protection. So there are policies there which are protecting them just about at all cost. However, there is change. Auckland Council, some of the recent consents have allowed for mangrove clearance where they're impacting on the foreshore areas.
There's quite a lot of debate about the impact of the spread of mangroves. Those who really support the idea that they should spread or should be preserved in their current form draw heavily on the original misconceptions that accompanied Professor Chapman's paper. Tropical mangroves and subtropical mangroves are totally different in terms of their biodiversity. They're larger trees with larger structures. They're more elevated with easier water flow through them. They support a variety of animals as well as fish life underneath them and a diversity of plants.
One of the problems we have, they've been given all of the benefits of tropical mangroves. In tropical areas, they don't go dry like ours do. So people, think, oh, fish breed in them. They don't. They go dry.
The problem with those subtropical, tropical mangroves is that they're receding. They're not advancing. And so there is a major issue to try and restore or preserve them. That's quite different here. We have a single species of mangrove that dominates. You don't get any variety underneath it.
I've noticed the huge changes in the flounder numbers. They've receded quite a lot from my young days, and that, I believe that's down to the overpopulation of mangroves in our creeks, which we never had when we were young. Compared to what's happening today, the creeks are blocked, causing havoc. And I know that the flounder species, mullet species in our creeks have diminished quite considerably.
All of the areas inland of the two causeways are now choked by mangroves. And that has an effect on the tidal prison. We're trying to keep the harbour open. So, if you reduce the amount of water coming in and coming out, that has other effects.
Well, I think the other point that many of the protagonists or advocates of mangroves miss out on is considering the economic benefit, or the cultural benefit indeed. I think there's a strong aesthetic benefit. Most people would rather see open water than a single height vegetation plantation in effect. They like to see tidal movement. It gives atmosphere to a place. They like to be able to use the recreational waters. They are diminished, badly diminished really, by the presence of mangroves. So I think there's an aesthetic loss, and that translates into an economic loss. Now, in a community like Mangawhai, we've got a pretty good feel for the impacts of any loss of quality of the harbour. Surveys show that both visitors and residents highly value that harbour. They see it as the highest priority for protection. It complements the surf beaches in terms of its recreational opportunities. It's used extensively for swimming. It still has sand areas in the lower harbour for paddleboarding, canoeing, and a bit of jet boating, which some of us think is probably a bit much, recreational fishing, and of course launching fishing into the Gulf. Many fishing boats, recreational boats, leisure boats leave the jetty here to go into the Gulf. A lot of those values, that combination of values brings people here. We know that there are at least 200,000, 250,000 people come each year to visit, as far as our surveys show. They spend in excess of $50 million getting here, which is income to transport suppliers and accommodation providers. And they spend at least 30, if not more, million in the local shops, sustaining retailing that wouldn't otherwise be here, jobs that wouldn't otherwise be here. So if we allow the continuing proliferation of mangroves to diminish the values of the harbour, we'll see a loss of property value, we'll see a loss of recreational value, and that will translate into negative economic impacts, quite significant ones. That has to be brought into our equation when we're balancing what do we do with the mangroves. So far it's been remarkably absent.
If in fact we were to allow no removal of mangroves, the mangroves would go and they would proliferate right through the mangrove, right through the estuary. And as a result of that, there would be all the level of sand build-up and silt build-up that you see as you go along Inslee Street. And of course that would mean that the tidal prism, the amount of water that flows in and out, gets reduced more and more, and ultimately it could get to the point where the natural outlet, which is up by the heads, gets clogged up again. And that's what occurred basically back in 1978. That occurred, and then the upper harbour became toxic. Then there was the breach through with storm activity, and also the fact that the estuary was eating into the sandspit, and we could end up back where we were. So that's probably from the most concern from the mangroves.
I think that people are letting entrenched views about their benefits get in the way.
So yeah, personally, I think if we just leave it, eventually it'll just choke the harbour out, and the long-term effect on Mangawhai would be a very big negative.
We're going to see the premature ageing of estuaries. In other words, they're going to infill, and I think that's a real shame.
If ever you look out on the sandspit, there is a lake in the middle of it. That's where the breach came through. And so ultimately there became a 600 wide breach. And so the locals decided that something needed to be done. They took action into their own hands, which was called the Big Dig. Unfortunately, the Big Dig didn't actually work. It needed a much more scientific approach. So consultants, the Labontes, were engaged and came up with a very cunning plan and basically dredged the inner harbour before and then created a bund wall, which you can still see the remnants of, and ultimately that was closed over. And so that activity was the reason why the harbour basically is at the moment flowing as freely as it is, because of the guys that went before.
It was before the Big Dig when the breakthrough occurred at the southern entrance. The first breakthrough of any significance was when a storm came through, and in the lowest part of that spit, the water washed through. And when it washed through, it was probably only high tides, and it was coming through at about, you could say 100 millimetres deep. That's about all. The boating and fishing club had tried with the various departments to be able to go out there and do something, and they were stopped. And so it wasn't until 1991 when it had really scoured itself out and it had become a southern channel, that people started to get a little bit itchy feet. And yes, 1990 it blocked completely, and that meant all the water coming into the Mangawhai Harbour came through this, what was then known as the southern entrance. The harbour was getting very polluted, and from the boat ramp all the way around to Picnic Bay, there was frothy scum on all the water there, and you couldn't swim in the water. And most of the water obviously was going up towards Mangawhai village, and the bit spewed around the end down there, no flow, and so it was just laying there stagnant. When the Big Dig came along, it was three gentlemen, Torchy Jeffries, Gary Bergen, Noel Cullen. They first put their heads together and came up with the idea. And then they came to see me, mainly because I was involved in the community. I'd been involved starting the golf club in 1978, and carried on supporting the community from there on. And so they came to me because they were looking for a spokesperson. And so that's how I come to be in the Big Dig just before 2 weeks before the Big Dig. When the Big Dig took place, it was to open the channel up, the original channel up, hoping that the southern entrance was going to seal itself. And we cut a channel about 25 metres wide, 2.5 metres deep. And we did it on the tides, and we cut it right through and out to Sentinel Rock. The day two, we set about restoring the rock groin out to Sentinel Rock, or Head Rock, as a lot of people know it is. And those stones had been flattened. They were still in the sand, but they were out there, and we had a chap with a digger with a hook on, that he pulled them out, and we rebuilt that causeway out there. On the third day of the big dig, although things, we couldn't widen the channel anymore that we'd dug, and we were watching the sand fall in off the banks of the far side. The water was tearing in and out, but we wanted to divert more water to come in the northern entrance again and not the southern entrance. So that's when we started the sandbagging opposite Bullock Point. The idea was we were going to be cutting off the main channel that was feeding into the boat ramp and Picnic Bay area, forcing the water to come in the way we wanted it to. Since the harbour restoration in 91, really, where the big dig started, that's when we started to get people more interested in the harbour.
The work that we do is each year we manage about 39 hectares of the mangrove removal, and we have a resource consent for that, which we got in 2013, which allows us for 35 years to remove mangroves. So we do, the public will see that mostly when they drive along Insley Street to the right hand side if going toward the school. You will see that those mangroves are cleared. That is the only areas that we are allowed to remove, and we only remove juveniles. We don't remove mature trees. So it's quite restricted, but it's made a huge difference to the outlook of Mangawhai when you go along Insley Street. We are not trying to eradicate any more mangroves. We probably would like to be able to, perhaps, or certainly people in the community would like us to be able to do that. But we have a resource consent, as I mentioned before, to remove an area of 39 hectares, which are only mangroves, only the juvenile mangroves.
Well, pretty much the harbour restoration has done the mangrove removal on the eastern side, and then clearing out the programs to clear out the new buds that just keep popping up, and it's just an ongoing thing to try and get that harbour flowing and flushing out. And so yeah, that's it. It's just going to be ongoing.
All the ratepayers within the Mangawhai catchment pay $80 a year to the Harbour Restoration Society, of which one guy said to me that it was the best money that was spent in Mangawhai. Anyhow, so yes, it goes towards the dredging activity. It also goes to us having to take any action against the Northern Regional Council or Auckland Council, as in case of supporting the Parkery people and so on. So so that's where the money goes, and obviously the equipment on the dredge and tractor and all those sort of things are not cheap to run. Since we carried out that work, the estuary, or the sandspit has grown by 30 hectares, which is pretty amazing. So, and also all the areas where the ferry tern nest now on the western side, which is where the Department of Conservation are now wanting the ferry tern to nest, is all being provided as a byproduct of our dredging activity. The other activities the harbour restoration do is that dredging is probably our major activity. As going back to the mangroves, the proliferation of mangroves has restricted the amount of water that flows in and out of the estuary. Technically it's called the tidal prism, and as a result of that, the harbour pre-1944 probably used to self-cleanse but now it doesn't, and a lot of sand and wind-blown sand from the sand spit, and also probably silt as well that gets dropped into the estuary, has to get removed to stop the build-up to keep the estuary clear. So that's one of the main activities that we do. We do that between March and the 31st of July, and that again, that is restricted around the ferry turn. The other couple of activities that we do is that we do planting. So we've planted over 400,000 or 500,000 spinifex and pinau over the last about 25 years to stabilise the sandspit, and we also carry out sand fencing, and we work predominantly with the Department of Conservation in the areas that we are to place sand and do our planting, and also we are currently doing sand fencing along with that. So those are the main activities that we do, other than any activities outside that, compliance activities that Regional Council or Auckland Council, such as the sand mining by McCullum's, we object to that on behalf of the community.
Wasn't long after that, I'd say 2 years after the big dig, we had a side group started, which was to monitor the ferry turns and report back to the Harbour Restoration Society, which worked fine for 6 months. Then they started to get a little bit more power happy, and I think a lot of that was driven by forest and bird that were entering into the scene quite big time then. So then all of a sudden, the harbour restoration went from restoring the harbour and doing what we were allowed to do and permitted to do, to not being allowed to do our dredging and harbour maintenance unless we had permission from forest and bird, and unless we complied with their days, hours, weeks of to be able to work there. So to me, that was starting to cause a division between forest and bird and the harbour restoration.
I know the ferry turns are iconic, they need to be protected, but I think that, you know, some of the measures that they're taking to protect them may be actually counterproductive. They needed, I think, the shallow open areas across the hard sand areas for feeding, rather than under the mangroves. They don't feed under the mangroves.
So when we pumped sand back in that area, we were pumping shell back in that area, we were creating an area that was second to none for the ferry turns. If they were left alone, I believe they'd be still flourishing now. Instead, we're trying to fence them off, push them up into one wherever they want to go, and putting a ring fence of a bit of electric tape around them, and saying, well, they stay there and hatch eggs. Well, that's interfering with nature as much, if not more, than what we ever did.
In terms of environmental side of things, in terms of what you talk about, things that have been done, there's an area called the Sand Island, which is sort of in the sands estuary area, and that in 1955 or thereabouts, there were only about 12 mangroves actually on the island. Eventually it became completely proliferated with mangroves. We were, as part of our resource consent, were allowed to remove those. Since then, the birds have all come back, because there were no birds on that within the mangroves, and now it's been designated as a significant bird area. So those are some of the environmental improvements, I suppose, that can be made with removal of mangroves. We're not saying that mangroves are a bad thing, they are a good thing. Obviously they've trapped all that silt and everything that's coming down, but at the same time, like anything that's caused by human activity, you have to use human activity to actually manage them at the same time.
Well, when we're looking at the threat that mangroves pose to the harbour and to all the values we associate with the harbour, climate change is a big one. It's an interesting one because there's a balance. If we have sea level rise and accelerated sea level rise, then over the decades we may well see mangroves retreat because the aerial rooting system no longer gives them access to oxygen. They do rely on that. On the other hand, we're seeing even through La Nina, through El Nino, our current climate phase, but particularly La Nina, increased volatile storms, heavier storms, often short inundation. We had significant flooding last year after Gabrielle, and in some respects that may have been attributable a little bit to the retention of waters, floodwaters in the upper reaches by mangroves and the sediment. But ultimately that weather will bring more sediment, it will raise the floor of the harbour through the impact of the existing mangroves and through their extension. So I think without an active management policy of mangroves, we'll see a loss of the harbour, but even more important will be an active land use program, a plan of action to cut down the threat of increased sedimentation, or cut back the sedimentation we're experiencing at the moment. That means much more sensitive land use policies and management of waterways and the like.
If the mangroves are left unchecked, then the health of the Mangawhai estuary is in jeopardy. The amount of water coming in and out of the estuary will decrease as the mangrove areas expand. And given the decrease in the tidal prism, then keeping the entrance open may become problematic.
In my time, there was a multitude of fish going up those creeks. We fed off those creeks. Today, we don't feed off them. We've got to have a boat to go out into the harbour to catch our fish. So there has to be something happening quite dramatically for that to happen. And yep, I'm not against environmentalists, no, I'm not saying that. But there has to be a happy medium where we can look at things from two perspectives.
Well, we have to find a solution to it. There has to be give and take on both sides. There has to be acceptance of what it was like, and acceptance of what made it to change. But we have to work together with all these other bodies as well.
We can keep I call the eastern side, if we can keep that clean and fruition and open, and that would be just a great benefit to our community. And it's actually aesthetically beautifully. It looks, you come in at night there and the harbour's full, tides in, just looks stunningly beautiful.
We've got to take a practical approach. The areas landward of the two bridges across the estuaries, I don't think we're ever going to control them up there. But the lower harbour areas, I think they should be controlled. They're going to be very hard to get rid of them completely, nor should we get rid of them completely. They are an indigenous species.
Well, I guess the future is about us being able to continue to manage the adverse effects of human activity. I know I bang on about that, but I mean, we look around everywhere and we see what human activity is, not just in our estuary, it's everywhere. But we've got to manage it in ways that we can. And in our case, obviously, keeping the estuary clear of sand, continuing the planting to make the sands a bit more stable, because obviously we've got storms, sea level rise, and so on activities. And we need to be able to continue to do that. So if we cannot renew our resource consent, and we've got that till 2048, so that's 35 years. So we did very well to get 35 years, to be honest. But it may be in 2048 very, very difficult to renew our resource consent. And if that's the case, and we can't do that, well then what I described before in terms of, again, mangroves being allowed to proliferate, and us not being able to dredge and all those things, well then basically we could end up seeing another, the estuary block up again at the heads, and consequences. I'm not saying that would occur, but you just don't want to take that chance.
The answer is, quite honestly, is to select areas where they should be controlled. If we don't control them, we're going to get ecological substitution and we are going to lose some valuable habitats. Just up the way here, we have a lovely rush area, saltwater marsh area that's being slowly invaded by mangroves. Ecological substitution, we're losing the clear sand flats, and they're being substituted with a completely different environment.
I think it's twofold. We have to continue to manage them. We have to continue to keep the juveniles in check. Ideally, we would identify areas that will benefit most from a reduction in mangroves through increased biodiversity and through increasing channel water movement. There may be ways of doing that through culverts, perhaps in our causeways, but that has to be accompanied by tackling the problem at source, which is from land use and that includes our urban land use, by the way. It includes the extensive urbanisation we're seeing happen at the moment. We have to have integrated plans for managing urban runoff. We can't just have subdivisions that rely on the goodwill of the people who build the houses or the subdivisions. And we have to look hard at our pastoral farming and forestry in the catchment.
Yes, I understand some of the environmental issues that we have with each other, with the environmentalists, but I think if we sit down and talk sensibly to each other and look at pathways to listen to some of our kōrero and listen to some of theirs, I'm sure we could strike a happy medium. I really do. We're all in favour of a beautiful environment. There's no doubt about that. But there are different ways of doing it. And I don't think blocking the creeks from the bottom of the edge of the harbour right up to the land mass behind us is going to do anybody any good.
Well, I think that new members and people that are coming up here do need to put a bit of effort into the environment that they love. The reason that they come up here and actually get in a bit more involved in the things that the community are doing. And it's not just the harbour restoration with our dredging and so on, but it's other people, the trackies and others that are doing all sorts of amazing things that the people who are new to here are the recipients of this, and they should not take that for granted. They shouldn't take the fact that the estuary and the harbour is the cleanest and the best harbour in Northland, and that's a fact. So, and it doesn't happen by chance. It happens because there are dedicated people willing to put in their own time for no cost to actually carry out this work. So my suggestion is, that those that are new get involved, get to know. You don't have to be on committees, but you do need to at least put the effort in to get a little bit of knowledge of what has gone before and what's happening now. There's some great stuff in the museum. Go and have a look and at what has historically been done and what needs to be done in the future.
My conclusion, based on the evidence that's there at the moment, is that the biodiversity and environmental benefits of open waters of the harbour and a much more defined harbour edge would exceed or do exceed any benefits that mangroves may bring. I don't see any benefits here because I see them, as I said at the outset, as a monoculture that simply reduces biodiversity, and within the harbour flats beyond the shoreline, I see them as an invasive species. Clearly others disagree with me. I think they've got to get the evidence together to show the balance before I would agree with them.
And I've got great belief in the community. I mean, going way back when the big dig occurs, the people who were in Mangawhai could see what was going on, and they could see it was what was happening. Yes, the bureaucracies, the Northern Regional Councils and DOC and all those just didn't want to know. Their attitude was, oh, well, just leave it alone, that's nature for you. But it's not. It's actually human activity. It's not nature at all. So I'm a great believer that in the future, people, if things come to a serious situation, I think that they'll react in exactly the same way. And at the end of the day, the community is about us, not about the Northern Regional Council or DOC's rules and regulations.